We're on DAF Yud Aleph, Amid Aleph, and at the very top, the Mishnah had told us that if you had prepared birds from before Yantif and they were in the dove coop, in the vestibule, and then you come Yantif morning and you see birds no longer inside, but they're outside, but they're mamish right outside, they're usher, because you have to be choshesh, you have to fear that perhaps these are different birds, that were not the ones that you prepared. We had seen a similar concept yesterday when we talked about blackbirds, and you prepared blackbirds and then it turns out to be white birds. And so Rava had told us we're talking about a case where there were two coops right next to each other and the birds switched positions. So you have to be choshesh that they came from the outside, they came from the veld. Lema misayele la Rabbi Chanina. Let us say that this Mishnah supports Rabbi Chanina exactly like we saw yesterday. The Amar Rabbi Chanina, rov v'karov heilach acher harov. That when you have a question as to where this object in front of me came from, did it come from a source that is proximal, or did it come from a source where there's an abundance of this item? We always say that you go according to the rov, where the abundance is. So therefore, we could either say that this bird came from inside the coop, or it came from the veld. And so we assume it came from the veld. This proves Rabbi Chanina's point. So the Gemara says, no. Amar Aryai BEITZA. We're talking about a coop that has a ledge, a perch, right outside the coop. So even if a bird came from outside, it first perched outside. And this is a regular occurrence. So it's not that we're choosing between rov and karov, but that the birds that come from the veld are also considered to be karov, because first they come to a rest outside the coop, and therefore there's more reason to assume that this bird came from the outside, because it has two things going for it. Number one, it's going to be karov, and it's going to be from the rov. Better to say that than to say that this bird came from inside the coop. Rava says, I don't see it that way. Rava says, really, the issue is that we're talking about not where there's only one vestibule, where there's one bird that was inside, and then later you find it outside. But we're talking about over here, Bishnei kinim zula mayla mizu askina. You've got two coops, Coop A and Coop B, okay, and one is above the other. And the issue is that you had prepared a bird in one of the vestibules, in one of the coops, and come the next morning and you see a bird right outside of it. The other coop had a bird in it that you had not prepared, you had not designated, and you come back the next morning and there's no bird in there at all. So the question is, the bird that's on this perch now, right outside the coop of the bird that you had designated, is it the bird that you had originally designated, or did it come from the other one? Is this the other bird? And velo mi baya, zimein betachtona velo zimein be'elyona matzah betachtona velo matzah be'elyona da'asiran. Not only is this true in a case where you had designated, you have A and B, and let's say A is on top and B is on bottom. Not only where you had designated the bird in B, and you come the next morning, there's no bird in A, and there's no bird in B, and there's a bird outside of B. He says, not only is that going to be usher, because there's clearly a reason to assume that a bird, as it comes out of its coop, is going to perhaps flit downwards to the lower coop. There you certainly have to be choshesh that this is not the bird that you prepared. Even if you had prepared the bird in A, and the bird in B, which was the lower coop, was one that you had not prepared. You come the next morning, there's no bird in B, and there's no bird in A, but there's a bird outside of A. Even there you have to be choshesh that this is the bird that originally was in B. Because we have to be choshesh that maybe what happened was the bird that I had originally designated flew the coop, and this bird came from B and just ascended, even though that's not as common of an occurrence of a bird flitting downwards, but yet it is possible sometimes for a bird to flit upwards as well. Is that the right word, flit? F-L-I-T? I think there is such a word like that. Okay, anyway. V'im ein sham elahein harei elu mutarin. But if the Mishnah had also provided for if there's no other birds in the area, then you are allowed to assume that this bird that's outside the coop was the same one that you had prepared the day before that was inside. So heichidami. So the question is, what are we talking about? If we're talking about birds who fly, let's say pigeons who have not had their wings clipped, right? So then how can you start talking about a situation where there's no birds around in the vicinity? There are birds everywhere. And if we're talking about flying birds, then this bird could have come from miles away. So ela b'midadin. So we must be talking about birds who have had their wings clipped, and they can only hop. They're hopping birds, okay? Or, what's that game?
Birds that can't fly.
They're birds that can't fly, like they're angry birds, right? They're the birds that, you have to put in a catapult in order to shoot them, right? So, Ideika kain beso chamishim ama adaduye adadu, v'idaleka kain beso chamishim ama pshita demutarin. He says, I don't understand why the Mishnah has to say anything at all, because if these are birds that can only hop and they can't fly, so then, obviously, if there is a nest that's within 50 amos of here, then it's possible that this could be another bird. And if there's no nest within 50 amos, then obviously this bird, there's no other birds that could be this bird other than the bird that I had prepared. Because we have a principle that's already been laid down from the ornithology expert Mar Ukva. He had said that a bird will not hop more than 50 amos away from its nest if it's just a hopping bird. So the question therefore is, what's the chiddush of our Mishnah? Because no matter how you look at it, it seems to be fairly obvious that you can make a very simple determination whether this bird is my bird or it's a bird that came from somewhere else. The Gemara says, La'olam di'ika kain beso chamishim am, ochagon dekaima bekeren zavis. The answer is that there really, in our Mishnah is addressing a case where there really is a nest within 50 amos. And you might think that if there's a nest within 50 amos, well, then you have to be choshesh that this is not the same bird. But no, because the case is, let's say the nest is 30 amos away, but there's no visibility between that nest and the coop that we're dealing with over here. And like Rashi shows you the diagram, because there's a barn or a house, there's some structure that obstructs the view between the two nests. That's what it means that they're on opposite corners. Okay, ma'udatema adaduye adadu. So you might think that, well, it's within 50 amos, so then a bird could potentially hop from one nest to the other. Kamash mula, no. Kol heicha de medade v'hadr chazi lekine medade v'ilo lo medade. That the only time a bird will hop away from its nest within 50 amos is only if it could still see its original nest. Birds are insecure, just like our children sometimes. They're not going to go away from the nest unless they can see their own. They can see home. If they can't see home anymore, they're not going to run too far away. Right? So that's the same thing with birds. Birds will only go away from their nest as long as they can still visualize, they have visibility of where they came from, which is an interesting vort, right? In other words, you can't hop too far. As a yid, you got to always remember where you came from. Next Mishnah. Beishamai omrim ein notlim es ha'ali lakatze v'lav basar u'beisel al matirin. So we saw this yesterday. An ali is a board of wood. It's usually used to crack kernels of wheat for the preparation of cereal. You're not allowed to do that on Yontif. That's considered to be too much of a preparatory act. That's not directly related to the preparation of food, so you can't do that on Yontif. So even though this kli is really designated for a forbidden use, that's why Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to use it, even if you want to use it as a butcher block to cut your meat. But Beis Hillel say it's fine, since you're using it for permitted use, you're allowed, and it's a kli, you're allowed to use it. Beis Shammai omer mei nosnenes or lifnei hadorson v'lo yagbehenu elim ken yeshimo kizayis basar Beis Hillel matir. And this we also saw yesterday, that the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, I've just shechted my sheep, and for its meat, which is perfectly fine on Yontif, the problem is the pelt is a very expensive component of the animal. If I don't do something to preserve it, it may spoil by the time Yontif ends. So therefore, Beis Hillel say that I'm allowed to place it down in a place where people will be stepping on it, because that helps preserve the hide. And Beis Shammai say that that's asur as well, because the hide is considered to be muktzah unless it has a kazayas of basar still attached to it. The Gemara now says, Tana v'shavin she'im kotzav alav basar sha'asar litaltalo. That the Brisa tells me that if it's after the fact, I've got my board, you remember that board that we talked about, this ali, that if I've already cut my meat on this board, then even Beis Hillel will agree that I'm not allowed to move this board around anymore, because now it's no longer has any permissible use, because I've already used it already. So Amar Abaye machlokes ba'ali aval betaver garmi divrei akol mutter. Next point. Abaye says the only time there's a machlokes is with this ali, which is normally used to crack wheat. However, if it's a butcher block, then Beis Shammai agrees that you're allowed to use it on Yontif, even if you didn't necessarily designate it from before. But since that's its designated use, it's perfectly fine. So frek the Gemara Pshita, Ali Tanan. Well, that's obvious. I mean, that's the Mishnah's only talking about an Ali. It's not talking about an actual butcher block. So the Gemara says, no. Mahu detema hu adin dafilu taver garmi nami v'haidik tani alilo dicha kochan de Beis Hillel dafil davar shmalach telisr nami sharu kamash malan. So the Gemara, Rabbi says, no, we just need to make this point, because you might have thought that the Mishnah's choice of talking about a board that is used for cracking wheat is just an example, and is to tell you how far Beis Hillel are matir, that you can even use a kli shemalachto le'isr that is normally designated for forbidden use. But really, maybe Beis Shammai would go so far as to prohibit even a butcher block. So Kamash Malan that no, Beis Shammai do not. Ika da Amri, others learn that Amr Abai lo nitzracha ela afilu taver garmi chadati. That some say that what Abai is trying to imply to us is that Beis Shammai will be permissive by a butcher block, even if it's a brand new butcher block. And that's the chiddush that Abai is trying to tell me, that even though it's a butcher block that you've never used before to chop meat, nevertheless, since you've designated it already for that use, it's still okay. You might have thought that Beis Shammai would prohibit it because since you've never used it before, maybe you'll decide not to use it for that use. And therefore it'll turn out that you'll have picked it up, schlepped it over, and then you'll decide, you know what, it's such a nice piece of wood, I don't want to use it to chop my meat on it, so kamash malan that you don't have to worry about that. So you mean that Beis Shammai is not worried that you're going to change your mind? Wait a minute, let me show you where that's not the case. V'hatanya, Beis Shammai omrim ein molichin tabach v'sakin eitzel behema v'lo behema eitzel tabach v'sakin. That there's a halacha that Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to exert yourself gratuitously on Yantif. So therefore they say that let's say you have an animal in one place, and you have a shaychit, and the shaychit's knife is somewhere else that's far away. So you're not allowed to schlep the shaychit and the chalaf all the way over to the animal, nor are you allowed to schlep the animal over to the shaychit and the knife if they're in too far distant places. Beis Hillel say no, of course you're allowed to do it. But what's Beis Shammai's reasoning? Beis Shammai omrim ein molichin tavlin umadoch eitzel meducha v'lo meducha eitzel tavlin umadoch. Beis Hillel omrim molichin ze eitzel zeh. And a similar machlokus is where Beis Shammai talks about a pestle and a mortar. That if, let's say, the pestle is in one place and the mortar is in another place and the spices are in another place, you're not allowed to schlep them all one to the other. They have to all be together before Yantif in order to permit you to grind the spices, to have fresh spices on Yantif. But Beis Hillel say no, even if the pestle and the mortar and the spices are in all different places, it's perfectly okay. But what do you see from here? What's Beis Shammai's reasoning? Why do they hold that it's problematic to schlep? Because they're worried that after you've schlepped, you'll change your mind. You'll be mamlich. You'll say, you know what? I've decided I don't really want to shech this animal. Or I've decided, you know what? I don't need this knife. Or I don't need these spices. And so you see that Beis Shammai is choshesh for people changing their mind to the point where they'll even prohibit you exerting yourself l'chatchila. So why shouldn't we say that if it's a brand new butcher block, Beis Shammai should prohibit you from using it because you may change your mind and not use it? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you the difference. Hachi hashta bishlama behema asilim luched amar nishbak hai behema kechusha umaisina behema achrisi deshmeina mina. He says, I'll tell you, by an animal, I can understand why Beis Shammai would say, don't schlep an animal, because by the time after you've schlepped it, maybe you'll bring it to the shaychet, you'll both look at it and say, hey, this is a skinny animal, let's get a fatter animal. People normally, it's very common for people to change their minds. Also, sometimes when you're cooking on Yontif, you could change your mind very easily. You could say, you know what? I thought I was going to make a stew that needs a certain kind of spice. But you know what? We don't need that stew. We'll make another kind of dish that doesn't require this spice. Like Rashi says, kagon kru v'lefes, like cabbage and turnip, right? That doesn't require the same kind of spicing that meat does. And therefore, maybe you change your mind. That's why Beis Shammai is worried. But But he says, but over here, you've already shechted the animal. You got to chop the meat on something. So why would you think that you wouldn't chop on this board if the whole board was designated for that purpose? What kind of changing of your mind is going to take place over here? And therefore, since it's less likely that you're going to change your mind, even Beis Hillel is matir. Next, Beis Shammai Omer Mei Nosne Nesaor, which we saw yesterday as well. The Mishnah says that you're not allowed to place a pelt in front of people to trample on it. So Tana v'shavin shemolchen alav basar litzli. The Brisa tells us that even Beis Shammai agree that here's something that you are allowed to do. You've shechted your sheep. Now you're dismembering it into cuts of meat. What do you have to do to meat before you cook it? You got to salt it. Now, when you roast meat, you don't have to salt it. But the minhag that's brought down in the Gemara is to apply a small amount of salt before the tzli process in order to help the fire extract the salt. When you're cooking something in a pot, then you have to salt it with an abundant amount of salt. So comes along the Brisa and says that if you're just adding a minimal amount of salt to this meat because you're going to roast it, then you're allowed to pour the salt on the meat over the pelt. That salt will have a side effect, have a side benefit of acting as a preservative for the pelt that is underneath. That's okay, say Beis Shammai, because you're doing it for its primary reason is for salting the meat and not for preserving the pelt. Amar Abaye lo shanu ela litzli aval kedera lo, and Abaye disqualifies the Brisa. That's only if you're using a minimal amount of salt for roasting, but not the abundant amount for cooking. Frak the Gemara pshita litzli tanan. Shkoyach Abaye, what are you telling me that the Brisa doesn't say explicitly? It says only when you're using salt for roasting. So hakamash malan dafilu litzli kein kedera asa. What Abaye is trying to teach me is be sparing in the amount of salt that you use, even when you're going to be roasting it. In other words, don't play games. You say, okay, I'm going to roast this meat. Then you take a whole ton of salt and pour it over the pelt so that you can preserve the pelt. Abaye says that doesn't work. It's not just that your objective has to be for tzli, but the amount that you use has to be commensurate with the normal amount that you're going to use for roasting. Tanu Rabbanan, ein molchen es hachalavim ve'ein mahavchin bahem. There's a brisa that says in a related issue, if you shechted an animal on Yontif, not only is the hide something of value, but also the forbidden fat. You can't eat that fat, so that fat is muktzah. So, but there's a commodity. It has value because what do you use the fat for? You use it for fuel. You can make candles. You can make soap out of it. It has a value, right? And so, but you can't do anything to preserve that fat. You can't salt it. And you're not even allowed to turn it over regularly so that it gets air circulation. But Mishum Rabbi Yoshua Amru Shodchan Baruch Al Gabi Yesedos. But Rabbi Yoshua says that here's what you are allowed to do. You take the fat, put it on a platform of some kind, like a pallet or pegs, so that the air can circulate in it in the wind, and that'll help preserve it until after Yantif when you can properly salt it. Amar Rav Masna halacha k'Rebbi Yoshua, and Ikadamri Amar Rav Masna ein halacha k'Rebbi Yoshua. So there are two versions of what Rav Masna says. Either he said we paskin like Rabbi Yoshua to be makel, to allow you to put it on pegs on a platform to let the air circulate around it, or he said we don't paskin like Rabbi Yoshua and we prohibit it. So Bishlam Laman Domer halacha k'Rebbi Yoshua itzrich sal kadaita chamini yachiv rabam halacha k'rabim kamash malan halacha k'yachid. I can understand the first version that says that we paskin like Rabbi Yoshua. So Rav Masna is telling us something important that I wouldn't normally know, which is that normally when you have a das yachid, you don't go like the singular opinion. You go like the majority. So over here, he's telling us that we paskin like Rabbi Yoshua, even though he's a das yachid. But Elalaman Domer ein halacha pshita yachid v'rabam halacha k'rabim. But if you go like the version that says that we don't paskin like Rabbi Yoshua, what is he telling me that I don't already know? We already know the principle that whenever there's a machloikis between the chachamim and one individual, that we go like the chachamim. So what is he telling me that I wouldn't know by myself? So ma'udatem mistaver tami de Rabbi Yoshua di lo sharis le'mimna v'lo shachit kamash malon. No, because you might have thought that Rabbi Yoshua is very sensible, in that if we don't allow you to preserve the fat in some way, maybe you won't shech the sheep in the first place, because you're going to say, I don't want to lose my investment, right? So therefore, Kamash Malan, that even though there's rationale to be makel like Rabbi Yoshua, so to allow a person to have more simchas yantiv, that far we don't go. So frak the Gemara Maishname or Lifnei Hadorsa. But let's think about this for a second. Why is it that we permit in the Mishnah to put the pelt down in front of tramplers, but we don't allow you to preserve the fat in any way? So the Gemara answers, Hasam lo mukcha milsa mishum dechazi lemizga alei. The answer between the two is as follows. When you put a pelt down on the floor, an onlooker could say, this is not a processing act. You're doing this because you want to put down a welcome mat for the guests, or you want a rug for people to be able to sit on. That was a regular occurrence, so it's not self-evident that you're doing this as a processing act. But hacha asilamemar, my time asharali rabbanan ki eichadelo lisrach. But over here, by the fat, by allowing you to put it on pegs, a person's going to look at it and say, well, listen, the rabbis let me do this. Why did they let me do this? Because they knew that I didn't want to lose my investment of the fat. So mali lemishtachinhu, mali lemimlachinu. So if they're already allowing me to preserve it this way, let me already apply salt to it. And the problem is that applying salt to fat is a malacha deoraisa, like Rashi speaks out. That's one of the forbidden 39 malachas. And therefore, if we, by allowing you to hang it in the wind, you're going to cause people to err in their halachic analysis, and they're going to end up doing a malacha on yantiv.
Trampling on the hide is not a malacha.
Well, no, it's not a malacha per se, because first of all, that's not the normative method of processing a hide. Hanging something in the wind is also not a malacha. It's only when you do it in the normative fashion, that you process it in the normative way, is it a malacha. But just by stepping on a hide, that's not a malacha.
So they couldn't sell it after Yom Tov. What happens
if it spoils over Yom Tov because it wasn't preserved? He's going to lose out on his investment. So you just have to hope for the best. It's not for sure that it's going to spoil, but a guy's going to be tzitering the whole Yom Tov. He's going to be worrying what's going to happen to the fat.
But in any case, do they allow to sell it?
Sure, of course. You're allowed to sell chaylev. You can get benefit from chaylev.
You prepared it in Yom Tov.
It's okay. Your objective was for meat. That was why you did it. After Yom Tov, if you have leftovers, you can sell it. Amar of Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Molech Adam Kama Chatichos Basar Bevas Echas, Afal Pi Sheino Tzarech Ela Lechaticha Echas. So here comes along a Shmuel with another heter, that even though, let's say you shecht a sheep, you only need half the sheep to feed your family. What about the rest of the meat? What's going to happen to it? We give you permission to salt the rest of the meat as long as you salt all of the meat at one time. Comes along Rav Ada Bar Ava, and he says, Ma'arim u'malach garma garma. What he did was different. It sounds like he's even more makel. He said you could salt the pieces individually, provided that you say, while you're salting, you say, you know what? I'm going to use this piece for yantif. Then you put that one aside. Says, nah, maybe I'll use this piece. And you salt it, put that one aside. Oh no, maybe I'll use this piece. As long as there's at least the possibility that you could use any one of the pieces, you can end up salting the whole animal. But obviously, you have to do this before you have your meal. Salt them all the different cuts of meat. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. We had seen this yesterday as well. We were talking about a peddler's box. And the peddler's box has a lid that in some way is attached to the box, has to be detached from the box in order to open it. The peddler uses the lid as a showcase for his wares. And we want to be able to allow him to open it and close it, because this will enhance simchas yantif. Because when there's more merchandise for the consumer, there's more simchas yantiv. So Chazal wanted to find a heter, and that's why, even though Beis Shammai is machmer, they don't allow you to remove the lid off the box, because that's an act of deconstruction. Beis Hillel will say, not only can you remove the lid from the box, you can even return the lid afterwards to the box, even though that's not a necessary component of the mercantile trade for the consumer. Nevertheless, if we don't allow the peddler to cover the box afterwards, he may not want to open it in the first place. The Gemara now says,
the markets are functioning on Yom Tov.
Yes, like we spoke out yesterday, you're allowed to conduct mercantile trade on Yantif, provided that there's no exchange of cash. So therefore, you can go, according to the Gemara, you could go to Sobeys, if Sobeys was a Jewish merchant, and say to him, Yankel, who's behind the butcher counter, say, Yankel, you know who I am, right? Give me a cut of meat, and we'll make a cheshbon after Yantif. Perfectly legal on Yantif to do that, for the sake of Simchas Yantif. My tris. So the Gemara's question is, let's just clarify what these tris and what these lids are. The word tris literally means a shield. So what is it? Amar Ula, sometimes we had seen trisin as being also a window shade or a window blocker. Amar Ula, trise chanuyos. This refers to the peddler's lid. Amar Ula, shlosha dvarm hitiru sofen mishum techilasan ve'eluhin. Ula said that there are 3 halachas where the rabbis allowed you to finish the act in order to allow you to do the first part of the act. And what do we mean by this? Or lifnei hadorsan. The first one is, we allow you to do the final act of putting the pelt before people to trample on it, because if we didn't allow you to do that to preserve the hide, you wouldn't come to shecht in the first place, and there would be a reduction of simchas yantif. Utrise chanuyos, we allow you, like Basil will say, to return the lid to the top of the box, because if we don't allow the peddler to do that, he may not open the box in the first place. And the third one, which we haven't seen yet, is v'chazoras ritiya b'mikdash, is we allow a kohen who has a bandage on his hand. I told you this would be relevant for the Gemara today. A Kohen has a bandage on his hand. We permit him not only to remove the bandage in order to do the avoda, but we permit him to return the bandage to his hand, even though that's the application of medicine on Yantif, which is an Isser de Rabbanan. Nevertheless, and there's a type of mimareach, of smearing involved, which is only a rabbinically prohibited act. Nevertheless, we permit it. Why? Because if we didn't permit him to return the bandage, he may not take it off in the first place, and there would be a problem with the avoda, because the avoda has to be done with the hands in direct contact with the sacrificial service. V'rachba amar Rabbi Yehuda afa poseh chaviso umaschil bi'isaso al gav haregel va'aliba de Rabbi Yehuda de Omar yigmor or lifnei hadorsan. I'm sorry, de Omar yigmor. Period. So it comes along Rachba, and he quotes his Rebbe Rav Yehuda. That's the way Rashi learns. It's not Rebbe Yehuda, but his Rebbe's name was Rav Yehuda. So he said, in the name of Rebbe, my Rebbe Yehuda. And what he's saying is as follows. And for this we need just a little bit of background. There's a halacha that's discussed elsewhere, that we know that an Am Haaretz is a person within temple society that is not meticulous in the laws of Tumah v'Tahara. And therefore, a chaver, who's a person who is meticulous, would typically protect his items from coming in contact with an Am Haaretz, because otherwise, if he eats everything b'Tahara, he's going to end up having his materials and his goods tainted. The Chazal made a special provision that on Yantif in Yerushalayim, all merchants who sell food do not have to worry about the touch of an Am Haaretz. Basically, they said you could set up shop in the Shuk in Yerushalayim, Machane Yehuda, wherever it is, and even though there are going to be throngs of Amaratzim that are going to be walking through, anything they touch does not become tameh. Why did they make this gezerah? Why did they make this takana? It's a special koyach. They made this takana because if we don't allow it, then no one's going to have food for Yantif. No one's going to want to open up their marketplace because they're going to be worried about the touch of an Am Haaretz. But it's only a provision during the Regel. Once Yantif is over, if an Am Haaretz touches the food, it becomes tainted. Now the question is like this. This is machlokas between the Chachamim and Rebbe Yehuda. An Am Haaretz touches a piece of meat that I'm selling in the marketplace during Chol HaMoed, and I end up with this piece of meat after Yantif. I didn't end up selling it. Okay? What's the status of the meat now? The Chachamim say that Limafreya, because the Am Haaretz touched it, that magic takana was only in effect during the Regel. Once the Regel is over, the meat becomes tameh. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Since he touched it during Yantif, it was safety, right? So he was covered. And therefore, even after Yantif, the meat is still okay. It's only if he touches it after Yantif does the meat become tameh, or the commodity, the dates or the wine, whatever he touched, become tameh. So, They basically said like this. So what Rachba is adding is, why did Rabbi Yehuda come up with this halacha that whatever he touched is considered to be tohar even after Yantav? The answer is because if we don't make this provision, the merchants are not going to want to open up a new barrel of goods. Let's say it's the 6th day of Pesach, right? And I've just run out of dates. I'm a date merchant. I got to open up, or figs, I got to open up a new barrel of figs in order to provide for my customers for the end of Yantiv. I'm going to say to myself, look, if I open up the barrel, and Haaretz is going to come, he's going to touch something in the barrel, I'll only end up selling a quarter of the contents of the barrel between now and the end of Yantiv, and I'll be left with 3/4 of a barrel that's considered tummy. I won't be able to sell it for the same price. I'm not going to open up the barrel, forget it. Rabbi Yehuda says no. That's going to cause people to have less simchas yantiv because they're not going to have as much merchandise to be able to purchase. So therefore, he feels that the takana is, like Rach was saying, we permit you to say that the merchandise will not become tamei even after yantiv. It will not be considered tamei, so that you'll be incentivized to open up the barrel, a new barrel on yantiv.
I think there's a bigger problem. Who is going to say that this guy is a
Okay, it's a good point. It's a good point. I acknowledge it's a very good point, but we got to finish the daf. So the Gemara now says, first of all, or lifnei hadorsim tanina. So shkoyach ula, you told me different cases of where we permit the end act because we want you to have the beginning act of simchas yantiv. Why did you have to tell me that it's explicit in the Mishnah that you're allowed to put down the pelt so that people can trample on it to incentivize you to shecht on yantiv? So ma'udetema tamayu de beisil mishum dechazil mizgo layu vafilu merav yantiv nami kamash malani tirusofa mishum tchilasen de yantiv in de erv yantiv lo. So the answer is like this. Ula wants to clarify the scope of Beis Hillel's heter. Beis Hillel, you might have thought without Ula that Beis Hillel was giving you a carte blanche and basically saying that, look, a freshly slaughtered animal pelt is never muktzah because you can use it as a rug. And therefore, it makes no difference whether you shechted the animal before Yantif or whether you shechted the animal on Yantif. Animal pelt is not muktzah. No, says Ula. There's a specific limitation here. The only reason why Beis Hillel permits you to handle this pelt is not because it's carte blanche non-muktzah. It's only that we made it non-muktzah. We gave you a heter to handle it to incentivize you to shecht on yantiv. But let's say you shechted the animal before yantiv and you're left with a pelt. Are you now allowed to pick up the pelt and process it on yantiv? Of course not. So that's the chiddush of Ula. You only have a heter to pick up this pelt and put it in front of the tramplers if you shechted on yantif itself. Next, Trisei chanuyos nami tanina. Beis Hillel matir nafla hachzir. We also, why does Ula have to tell me the halacha that you're allowed to return the peddler's lid? That's in the Mishnah. The Gemara says, "Ma'u detema tamayu de Beis Hillel mishum dein binyan bekelim ben stira bekelim vafilu debatim nami kamash malani tirasofa mishum tchilas and chanuyusin debatim lo." This is the same principle. You might have thought just by looking at the Mishnah that Beis Hillel gives you a carte blanche to always put affix lids back to their boxes or take lids off their boxes, regardless of the amount of effort that is required to put these things together and take them apart. Why? Because there's no din of construction or deconstruction when it comes to movable property. A box is movable. The only time there's a problem of affixing like a door to a structure is only when you're dealing with something that's attached to the ground, like a house. But if you're dealing with a movable item, there's no problem at all. But that's not the reason why Beis Hillel allowed the peddler to put the lid back on. They only permit the peddler to put the lid back on because we want to give people more simchas yantiv. So therefore, let's say the peddler already had the box, or let's say, or we're not dealing with a peddler. Let's say we're dealing with you in your house, and you have a box, and you want to put a lid back on the box. If you're not a merchant and you're not providing to the public, we don't give you a heter to put the lid back on carte blanche. That's the chiddush of Ula. And let's talk about his third case, chazoris ritiya b'mikdash nami tanina. That thing that you're allowed to put, the Kohen's allowed to put back his bandage on after the avoda. That's also an explicit Mishnah. It says machzirin ritiya b'mikdash avalo b'medina, that you're allowed to put back on your bandage inside the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside the Beis HaMikdash. So why do you need Ula to tell me this? So ma'udetei matama mai mishum de'ein shbus b'mikdash afilo kohen delav baravodahu kamash maloni tirasofa mishum tchilas and the baravoda in delav baravoda lo. So the answer is, again, the same principle. You might have thought that the reason why a Kohen is allowed to restore his bandage in the Beis HaMikdash is because Bichlal, there's no rabbinic, you don't have to consider at all any rabbinic prohibitions in the Beis HaMikdash. And since putting on a bandage is only a rabbinic problem, so therefore you have a carte blanche to do it whenever you want. So the Chiddush of Ula is, no, they only gave this heter to a person who's doing the avoda to make sure that he'll operate the avoda with his hands free. But if you're not doing the avoda, then you don't have a carte blanche to put on a bandage inside the Beis HaMikdash. So Ula wants to clarify that. Now let's look at the fourth case, which was not offered by Ula, but which was offered by Rachba. And he said that this case also, according to Rebbe Yehuda, they permitted sofan mishum tchilasan. They told you can do even the final act of that the Am Haaretz's touch does not taint the food even after Yantif. And the reason why they did it is because they wanted there to be more merchandise available on Yantif. So Paseches Chaviso Nami Tanina. That also was taught in a Mishnah. Paseches Chaviso Maschel Bisasel Gava Regel. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yigmar V'Chachamim Omrim Lo Yigmar. It's a Mishnah. It says that if a person opens up a new barrel or he starts with a new clump of dough and he sells it on Yantif, then even if an Am Haaretz and he's got leftover, that's after Yantif, if the Am Haaretz had touched it during Yantif, so Rebbe Yehuda says it's still Tohar, and the Chachamim say it's Tameh. So why did you need Rachba to add this? The answer is Ma'udatei Matumas Amaretz Beregel Ketar Shavua Rabbanon V'Alfagav Lo Hischil Nami Kamash Maloni Tirusofa Mishum Tchilas and Hischil in Lo Hischil Lo. The answer is like this, that you have to understand, says Rachba, that the whole heter that Rebbe Yehuda gives is as an incentive for a merchant to open up a new barrel over the course of Yantif. But it's not like there's just a carte blanche that if an Am Haaretz touches something, it magically that there's no tumah. No, that's not true. Let's say the merchant had opened up the barrel from before Yantif, right? And there's no concern that he's going to that we want to incentivize him to open up a new barrel. So there, Rachba just wants to clarify that in that situation, the tumah will actually go back, right? That it's only that when you're contemplating to open up a new barrel, Rabbi Yehuda guarantees that by opening up the new barrel, you won't be left with leftover merchandise, right? But if you already had an open barrel from before Yantif, you don't have this protection mechanism. And after Yantif, the touch of the Am Haaretz will retroactively be problematic. So now the Gemara's question is, V'ula mai taima lo omar? Why did Ula not add this fourth one? Why did Rachba only bring it in, but Ula did not bring it in? So the answer is the Gemara, Haba plukta lo kamairi. Because Ula only wanted to list those cases where it was clear-cut, where no one was arguing. But in the case of Rebbe Yehuda, the heter is only according to Rebbe Yehuda, but the Chachamim don't consent to that heter. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Hanach nami plukta ninu? What do you mean? The case of the pelt is not a machlokas, it's a machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. What do you mean Ula is not talking about machlokas? The Gemara answer is no, because Beis Shammai b'makom Beis Hillel ain't a Mishnah. No, because anytime there's a machlokas between Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and the Mishnah, we don't even reckon with the opinion of Beis Shammai because there's such a preponderance of times that we go like Beis Hillel, we don't even have to consider Beis Shammai's position at all. Masnisan deloki haitana. So now the Gemara says, it seems like our Mishnah is not like the following Tana when it comes to the box. The Tanya, Amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Modim Beis Shammai Beis Hillel Shemesalkin Esatrisin B'Yom Tov. That it says in the Brisa, that Beis Shammai Beis Hillel agree that you're allowed to remove a lid on Yantif. Lo nechliku ela lahachzir. The machlokas is only to restore the lid, to return the lid. She Beis Shammai omer mein machzir, Beis Hillel omer mav machzirin. Right? That Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to put it back, and Beis Hillel say you're allowed to put it back. So our Mishnah clearly disagrees with this brisa, because our Mishnah says that according to Beis Shammai you're not even allowed to remove the lid. And yet this brisa says that Beis Shammai holds that you are allowed to remove the lid, it's only a machlokas is putting it back. So the Gemara says no, it's not a machlokas of brises, because Bamed Dvar Mamurim b'sheyesh lahen sir, aval ein lahen sir divrei hakol mutter. Because our Mishnah is talking about where there's a hinge. There's a type of hinge apparatus that requires you to clasp or to attach the lid and to detach it from its hinge. So in that situation, that's why our Mishnah says that Beis Shammai is more machmir, not even to allow you to remove it in the first place. The Bryce of Reb Shimon is talking about where there's no hinge at all. It's just very easily removed and very easily put back on. How can you say that, says the Gemara? But there's another brisa that says that the only time that Beis Hillel permits you to remove and restore the lid is only when there's no hinge. How can you now tell me that our Mishnah is talking about where there is a hinge? Because this brisa says that when there is a hinge, everyone agrees that you can't take it off. Right? So Amar Abaye, so Abaye says, let me explain to you. B'sheyesh lehen sir min hatzad divrei hakol aser. Ein lehen sir kol ikar divrei hakol mutter. Ki pligi b'sheyesh lehen sir be'emtza. So the issue is that there are three types of boxes. There's one box that has no hinge at all. It has no a clasp or clasping apparatus whatsoever. There's another type of box which has a hinge in the middle. It's not really a hinge. All it is two pegs come from the two ends of the box, and there are two holes in the lid that fit into the pegs. And that's a very loose kind of attachment where it's very easy to maneuver the lid off and back on. Then there's the third type of hinge, which is called the hinge from the side, which is a much more elaborate apparatus of detachment and reattachment. And that's where basically it works like this. When it's a hinge from the side, where it's more elaborate, everyone agrees that that's usher. Both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to remove it, you're not allowed to return it, because there's mamish construction and deconstruction. When there's no hinge at all, everyone agrees that you're allowed to remove the lid, and Beis Shammai only says you can't put the lid back on. Where's the machlokus of our Mishnah? Where the hinge is in the center. You got those two pegs and the two holes in the lid. That mar savar gazrinan sir be'emtza tu tzir min hatzad, umar savar lo gazrinan. That Beis Shammai say, no, you can't remove it, you can't put it back on, because if we allow you to do it with this box, you're going to come to do it with the box that has the elaborate hinge on the side. And Beis Hillel will say, no, everyone can tell the difference between this kind of hinge with the pegs and the more elaborate hinge on the side, and therefore with this kind of box, you can take it off and put it back on. Have a wonderful day.